Coming at number 10 now, we have the Millers. This one comes from Reddit user WGES Scott. He said that he grew up in a poor family in South Dakota. His town had just 530 people in it, so he would often spend his time in the local library reading. On one such day, he was reading a history book about his area. It talked about a family called the Millers. Even though he didn't like his grandma, he asked her about them. She refused to say. He asked his aunts and uncles, and eventually he found out that in the 1930s, a family called the Millers had abandoned their property and moved to California. He got curious and decided to look for this house. Even though his family said it was foolish, there was nothing there, it was just a wasteland now. He cycled out to the place, and to his amazement, he saw a pyramid-looking object sticking out of the ground. As he got closer, he realized it was actually a roof. The building was buried in the ground. He climbed into the attic and saw some holes going down to the rooms underneath. He glanced into one, and for a second he thought he saw something or someone lying on the floor. He ran as quick as he could all the way back home. His friend didn't believe what he had found, so he took him there. However, when they arrived, they found the exact spot. They could see the tracks from where he was before, but the house had gone, vanished. There was nothing there at all. His tracks looked like he had just walked around the area in a circle. His whole family laughed at him, but in the 30 years since then, he has sworn that what he saw was true. Next up at number 9 now, we have tennis camp. Reddit user Old Trafford 24 said that when he was 11, he went to a tennis camp. He travelled there with his mum, and every day something odd would happen. As they walked past a fire hydrant, a boy on a bike would cycle past and ring his bell. Then an old woman would yell at him about 20 feet down the road. The boy followed the same path, and the woman was always in the same exact spot, yelling the same thing. It freaked him out, like they were stuck on some sort of perfect loop. He joked with his mum that they were aliens. His mum explained what a coincidence was. He knew what a coincidence was, and this didn't feel like it. The next Friday, they followed the same route. This time, something was different though. The boy didn't ride by. The woman didn't scream at him. She was nowhere to be seen. But then, inside a store by the side of the road, he saw them. They were both standing there an inch from the glass, heads facing downward slightly, staring directly at him. They didn't move a muscle, they didn't blink. He never saw them again, but said he will never forget how creepy it was. Moving on to number 8 now, we have the melting face. This one comes from Reddit user Spider Lane Wales, who says that when he was very young, he slept in his parents' bed one night. He woke up and remembered the clock read 4 a.m. There was something standing by the window, looking out into the front yard. It looked like a man in a brown wool robe. He was about 6'4". He sat up in bed, and the thing turned round and looked at him. He never forgot the face. Pale white skin, covered in wrinkles. The face drooped like it was melting down into a pointed chin. Later in life, he saw the famous Scream mask and thought it reminded him of that. However, despite the face resembling a mask, it still looked alive. Its mouth was hanging open and its eyes were wide, almost like it was worried or scared. It stared at him while it moved from the window, past the bed and out of the open bedroom door. The second it exited the room, the lights turned on by themselves. Both his parents jumped up on either side of him, breathing heavily like they'd just woken up from a nightmare. They don't remember anything before waking up, but he still does. Next up at number 7 now, we have the toilet squid. This one comes from Reddit user Raise the Avank, who said that he grew up in California and his family would often visit Big Sur for camping, hiking and such. During a visit when he was 7, he went to the bathroom in a restaurant called the River Inn. There were 3 cubicles, including one handicapped one. He went into one of the regular ones as the other 2 were taken. He remembered looking underneath the doors to see if there was anybody in the other cubicles, but there was nobody, but they were still locked. Then he looked into his own toilet and saw a huge squid. The body was at least a foot long, with tentacles coiled around the inside of the toilet bowl. It filled all the available space, its cloudy squid eyes gazing up at him. He ran out of the bathroom, told nobody, and waited 45 minutes to use the toilet at home. He said 25 years later, the empty locked cubicles and the toilet squid still freak him out. Moving on to number 6 now, we have the bus trip. This one comes from a Reddit user called Bananas. She was on a 15-hour bus trip with her family through Mexico. It was late at night. After several hours, they stopped at a gas station. That's when she noticed there were a lot of police cars around. When they got back on the bus, their driver told them that the police had received a tip that their bus was being targeted for a robbery by Mexican bandits. The police would escort them. They drove for hours along a winding road on the side of a cliff. One police truck pulled in front, another went behind. All of the police officers were armed. Even as a kid, she was on high alert, but eventually fell asleep. She woke when the bus came to an abrupt stop. She remembered peering out of the front window and seeing some large rocks that had clearly been placed across the road. Everything was dark except for the rocks illuminated by the bus lights. She knew that if the police weren't there, the bus driver would have got out to remove the rocks, and then the bandits would have attacked, robbed, and possibly even killed all of them. The scariest thing was that even though the police were there, the bandits must have been nearby, lurking in the trees. waiting. Next up at number 5 now we have the Arctic Lights. This one comes from Reddit user Meaningless Debate Man. He said that he grew up in the Arctic Circle. One night he borrowed his parents' snowmobile to head out of their small town. He wanted to go and lie in the snow away from the light pollution and just watch the northern lights and whatever else passed over that clear night sky. As he was lying there, he heard a clicking noise and presumed that it was just his snowmobile cooling down. When he realized it wasn't that, he thought it might be an animal nearby, but it was too mechanical for that. Then he noticed the sound was actually coming from above. He scanned the sky but found nothing. Just before giving up, he noticed something strange in the northern lights. There were 3 strong points of light getting steadily brighter. The clicking noises got louder too. Then it all stopped, like nothing had happened at all. He heads back home on his snowmobile, wondering if he was going crazy. His house was quiet when usually his family would still be awake. It wasn't until he got into bed and looked at the time that something hit him. It was almost 6 AM. He had gone to lie in the snow at 11 PM. He thought he had seen those clicking lights for just a few moments, but in reality, he'd been staring at them for almost 7 hours somehow. What were they? How did they do that to him? Your guess is as good as mine. Next up at number 4 now we have the abandoned hospital. This one comes from Reddit user Uzero. As a kid, he and some friends decided to check out an abandoned mental hospital. The only way in was through the autopsy room. When they got inside, one of the girls started crying and said she wanted to go back. They tried to convince her otherwise, but to no avail. As they walked out, he took one last glance back at the building. It was dark, but there was a little moonlight. There, on the second floor, was a girl in a white dress standing at the window, watching them leave. He stared at her and made his friend watch too. He thought it might be a trick of the light, but after 20 seconds or so, the girl moved. They ran as fast as they could away. When they got home, they tried to just brush it off and explain it away, but they couldn't, and even today, they still can't explain the girl in the window. Moving on to number 3 now, we have the nursery. This one comes from DJ Liz. For this one, his mum was actually pregnant with him, but it's too good to miss out. His parents had just bought their house, and within a few days, the neighbours came over to introduce themselves. They also told his parents that the previous owners had moved out after a nasty divorce. You see, their second baby had died suddenly, and their relationship fell apart from there. His parents were horrified and couldn't imagine going through the same thing. They eventually almost forgot about it, and life went on. In preparation for the baby, they decided to put new wallpaper in the nursery room. His dad told his mum there was no need to wallpaper the inside of the closet, but she insisted. She was kneeling down, scraping off old paint inside of the closet when her eyes fell upon something and she froze in terror. There, written in crayon at about the eye level of a toddler, a childish scribble said, "I killed the baby." Now they knew what happened to those parents' second baby, and it looks like the first was to blame. Next up at number 2 now, we have the long skirt. One Reddit user said that his dad used to help look after an old house and would go and check on it every 6 weeks or so. He would go along with his dad on Sunday mornings because he loved the building and the history it had. So many people had lived and died within its walls. On one such morning, his dad was working away and he was playing upstairs in the room that used to be for a child. He always liked playing in that room. He had been playing for about 5 minutes before he got the strange feeling that someone was watching him. He turned around to see what looked like a long skirt follow someone down the hallway. He snuck out to see who was there and caught a quick glimpse of the back of a woman walking into another room. He entered the room literally 2 seconds after, and the place was empty. There was only one door into that room as well. He told his dad and they searched the house. It was empty. But he knew what he saw, and he knew it must have something to do with the history of the old building. And finally, number 1 now, we have the blue dress. This one comes from Mr. Hegel. He said that when he was younger, he used to think he was having dreams of an old woman in a blue dress and cat-eye sunglasses sitting at the end of his bed singing to him. She'd always sing the same song and then just leave. One night he followed her into his brother's room. Instead of singing to him, he woke up and the two began talking. After 20 minutes, their mother came in and asked what they were doing. His brother said he was just talking to the lady in the blue dress. The mother sent them to bed. The next day, she told him to stop sneaking out of bed in the middle of the night to play with his brother. He asked her what she was talking about and she gave him her version of what happened, which was the same except no lady in the blue dress with cat-eye glasses. The woman stopped visiting him after that and he began to wonder if it had ever happened at all. A while later, his aunt came to visit visit and refused to enter the house from the outside. They asked her why, and she said there was an old woman standing in the upstairs window wearing cat glasses and a bright blue dress. Starting off at number 10 now, we have the face. This one comes from user Spider Lane Wales. He said when he was about 6 years old, he was sleeping in between his parents one night. It was about 4 a.m. and he saw something standing by the window, looking out over their front yard. It looked like a tall man wearing a brown wool robe. He started to stir and sat up in bed. The thing turned around and looked at him. One thing he will never forget is the face. It was unearthly, extremely pale with many wrinkles, and it drooped like it was melting right down to a pointy chin. It almost resembled the Scream mask, except real flesh and blood. Its mouth was hanging open and its eyes were wide as if it was also terrified. It stared at him while it moved away from the window, in front of the bed, and then out of the open bedroom door. The exact moment it exited the room, the lights turned on by themselves. Both his parents jumped up either side of him, breathing heavily like they'd just woken up from a nightmare. It wasn't until many years later that he told them he'd seen the nightmare with his own 2 eyes. Next up at number 9 now, we have the old woman. This one comes from user PM Me Your Poem. He said that he was laying in bed one night as a kid. It was pitch black except for some light creeping under the door from his landing. They had recently moved into the house, and while his mum's room was being worked on, she was sleeping in his room on the floor. He looked up and saw the door slowly creak open. An old woman peered around the door, looked right at him, and then just slinked away. Even though he was a kid, he didn't freak out and told himself it was fine, it was just a nightmare, he was just seeing things. Despite this thought, he still quickly turned over and dove under his covers, hoping he would wake up. He sat there in silence, waiting for the nightmare to be over. Then he heard his mum whisper to him from the floor, saying, "Did you just see someone peer around the door?" Safe to say they both didn't sleep a wink that night. Coming in at number 8 now, we have the stalker. This one comes from Reddit user Yeah But That's Nothing, and they said that as a kid they would sometimes sleep with their bedroom lights on, light blaring out through the windows. One night she awoke to the sound of metal scraping outside, like something was being dragged. There was a thunk noise against the wall outside the window, and then the sound of someone climbing a ladder. She watched, wide-eyed and frozen in fear, as a man she'd never seen before looked at her straight through the window. Their eyes met and they just looked at each other for a moment. Then she closed her eyes and pretended to be asleep, but really she was just squinting and still watching him. He stared in silence for a few more minutes. Then she saw a bright camera flash. He climbed back down the ladder and dragged it away into the night. She never saw him again. Next up at number 7 now, we have Minnie Mouse. This one comes from MD Nightwriter. They said that when they were little, they had a Minnie Mouse plushie. It had a cute costume and big open-mouthed grin. She even had a studio portrait taken with it. When she woke up one morning, she looked at her toys scattered on the ground and her eyes fell on Minnie. Then Minnie started talking. At first it was just a hissing noise, then Minnie started whispering her name. She froze as she watched Minnie's mouth open and close slowly. She ran out of the room as fast as she could. Her parents dismissed it as just imagination until she showed them that the doll's mouth was permanently closed now. They went to look at the studio portrait that had been taken months before, and sure enough, the mouth was open. She never touched that doll again, and the family rarely speak about the whole affair. Moving on to number 6 now, we have Shh. That's what I'm calling it. This one comes from PM Me for Small Talk, possibly the same person who told a story earlier in the video. Well, he has another story. He said once as a child, he and his sister were having a prank war for about a week straight. They agreed to a ceasefire as his birthday was in 2 days. Very fair. He had just turned 11, and that night he heard his closet door open. He knew it was his sister. She was about to prank him on his special day. I'll show her, he thought. He decided to surprise her by flinging open the closet doors before she could jump out. He slowly got up, but before he could get to the closet, the doors opened and she stepped out, except it wasn't his sister. It was a grown woman with long black hair covering her face, a face riddled with scars. He wanted to scream, but he just froze and silently started whimpering and crying. She put a finger up to her lips and let out a slow shh. She then opened the window and crawled out, slowly closing it behind her, never to be seen again. To this day, he's not sure who or even what she was, and whether she will visit him again one day soon. Moving on to number 5 now, we have the bones. This one was from user Bathysphere710. He said that when he was a kid, his dad would take he and his sister to a giant lake with a big sandy shore, sort of like a landlocked beach for hillbillies. his words. He was wading in at the shallow end when he felt something brush through his fingers. As he was only 7 years old, he was imagining that he was at a really nice beach, and he thought to himself, maybe these are sea plants. He snapped out of it though when he remembered that this wasn't that kind of beach. As he squeezed the tendrils brushing his hand, they squished and sunk through the soft, squishy mass, and then he felt bones. They were finger bones, belonging to a child that would have been about his age. He got out of the water, sat on the shore, and told no one. A year later, his sister told him that that same day she thought a boy had been kicking her under the water, but when she grabbed at the foot, it felt cold and squishy, and she also told no one. Moving on to number 4 now, we have the poke. This one comes from Diamond Eyes 7, who said that when she was a child, her grandparents' house always creeped her out. She was terrified of the basement. There was just something that was off about it compared to the rest of the house, at least. When she was about 10, she and her mum were sleeping in her grandpa's bed. She couldn't sleep and was facing the middle of the bed so that the back of her head was facing the nearby window. All of a sudden, she felt something poke the back of her head. Once and then twice. She was petrified and frozen solid. She wanted to turn her head and see what just poked her, but she just couldn't bring herself to turn around. To this day, she still doesn't know what it was that poked her from the window, but when she thinks about it, it's like she can still feel the pokes, as clear as the night they happened. Next up at number 3 now, we have the auntie. This one comes from user YOLO the Swagnificent. Amazing name. This story is creepier than the name though. When he was a kid, he had a dream that his aunt came to visit. He was actually named after her husband, his uncle, who had died just a few months before he was born. Because of this, he was always very special to her. After the dream, he went into his parents' room and told them that Auntie Liz had come to see him in his dream and that she told him to say goodbye. Just a few hours later, he got a phone call that she had passed away. A few years later, his grandfather's friend Mary got brain cancer. She lost the ability to speak and her face was paralyzed. The last time he saw her, he told his mum he just wanted to see her smile one more time. A few nights later, he had a dream where she was smiling at him. A few hours after that, his parents got the call that she had passed away. A final twist to the story is that when he was about 11 or 12, he had a dream that his dad died. His dad was terrified for weeks. His dad was fine though, he did survive, but now the whole family is very scared of this bizarre dream death power that he seems to have. Moving on to number 2 now, we have the hand. This one comes from the user You Shouted This. Her name is written in caps. Nice one. She said that her family was very religious when she was growing up. One time she was in church and they asked a few members of the congregation to go to the front so they could pray for a specific person. Her aunt took her up, they closed their eyes, started singing and lifting their hands up in prayer. After about a minute or so, she felt someone's hand touch hers. It was flat against her hand. She swayed and continued singing without opening her eyes. She thought the hand belonged to the pastor's wife, who she really liked, and was happy that she had chosen to pray with her. After a few minutes though, she decided to break the protocol and open her eyes to smile at her. When she did though, she quickly realized it wasn't her. It wasn't anyone, in fact. She looked from side to side to see if maybe the person had moved to pray with someone else, but everyone was just doing their own thing. There was no one next to her, even though she definitely felt someone's hand touch hers just before she opened her eyes. After all, wouldn't you be sure if someone touched your hand? And finally, number 1 now guys, we have the witch. This last one on our list comes from user MTMB17. She said that when she was 8 years old, her bedroom was down a hallway by itself. She had a window in there that had been broken, so there was actually just a piece of wood in place of the bottom part. The window was high up and nobody could reach it easily. Her mother had been cleaning her room that night and had her go back in there to get her glass of tea that she had left in there. When she walked in, she glanced at the window and there, clear as day, was a rigid grey, bony, witch-looking finger with a long, dead-looking nail and bumps all along it. The finger was an abnormal length and was just above the piece of wood. It was beckoning her to come to the window. She dived under her bed and screamed out for her mother. She shouted that she was too scared to come out from under the bed. Her mum said that she was too tired to get up and didn't seem to understand the severity of the situation. She eventually crawled out from under the bed and darted out of the bedroom. It's been many years since that day, but she still remembers the finger clearly. clearly and still wonders what she was being beckoned towards.
Alright, coming in at number 10 we have the wolf. So like I said, you guys seem to like it when I share my own stories with you, so I'm sharing right now. If you ask me if I've ever seen a ghost, there are a few moments where I can identify feeling strange or watched, but there is one time when I was around 5 or 6 years old that I feel like I actually really did see a ghost, and now, decades later, I can recall the moment with absolute clarity. So my sister and I used to watch a show called Gladiators on a Saturday night. My mum used to be a bit concerned as it was a wrestling style show and some of the characters were a bit scary, including a gladiator called Wolf. But it was on at 6 PM and we were allowed to watch it together so long as we got to bed before 8. One weekend we were staying at my nana's house. Now this was pretty normal, often my sister and I and my cousins would stay there. She had a big old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere and all of the kids had a room to sleep in. Now next to that room, connected by a door, was the so-called playroom that absolutely none of us children ever wanted to play in ever. I don't know why, we just hated it in there. It was a creepy room. Anyway, one night after watching Gladiators, my sister Julia and I were put to bed. Now we slept in twin beds with me closest to the window and Julia closest to the door. Now that night I woke up in the middle of the night in a massive panic. I looked around the room and saw a figure crouching by the door of the playroom. It was a black shadow with bright, wide yellow eyes, almost like an animal. To me, he looked a bit like a wolf. Now he looked at me and from across the room, it or him, I'm not sure, jumped on all fours to the bottom of my sister's bed. She stayed asleep, but he looked at me directly in the eye and then disappeared. To this day I still remember it. I don't know if Gladiators had scared me, the playroom had scared me, or I'd seen a ghost. Coming in at number 9, we have fast food, fast exit. This story was shared on Reddit by UCQ, who, unbeknownst to them, was caught up in a life or death situation. Receiving 8.2 thousand upvotes, they wrote, "When I was like 4 or 5, my mum and brother and I went along with my dad on a business trip to Seattle. I have a distinct memory of being in a Taco Bell or a McDonald's, I can't remember which, but I remember waiting in line, getting to the front, then my mum talking to us, and we left very quickly. I remember being so disappointed and my brother and I were whining and complaining until we got to the next place. A couple of years ago, I'm 28 now, it somehow came up in conversation and my mum told us the whole story. We got to the front of the line and the cashier said in a quiet voice, 'Those men over there are robbing us. They have guns. Take your children and leave now.' So my mum did exactly that and never told us what happened." Now one of the comments read, "Best cashier ever," and I think so. I honestly really hope that they were okay. Coming into number 8, we have Take Me Home Country Road. Reddit user Torchlit shared their scary childhood story. Have a listen to this, it really freaked me out. They wrote, "My friend and I were riding our bikes down a rural country road. A beat up panel van kept trailing behind us slowly, even though we pulled over multiple times to let it pass. Every time we did so, it slowed to a stop behind us. Now eventually we came to a T, so we pulled over again on the road, turning right so the van could get by. Now they continued by saying instead of passing them, it gunned the accelerator and pulled up next to them, opening the car door. Now thankfully another car arrived at the T-junction and the van pulled away. The door to the van slammed shut and it screeched off, never to be seen again. Now a couple months later my parents were watching the news and a picture of a very similar van came on the screen and I said, 'Hey, my friend and I saw that once,' and my parents quietly freaked. Apparently it belonged to a dude that had been charged with child pornography and molestation and had just got out of jail. Can you even imagine? It sounds like they were actually nearly abducted. Who knows how many of us have had near abduction experiences like that. There are some creepy people out there." Coming in at number 7, we have The Attic. This story comes from redditor No Cats on Me iMac, who used to have a door in the attic in her bedroom. Now her bedroom was attached to a door that led to the attic, I'm not sure if I made that clear. The attic was quite a big space and often her mum would pop up there sometimes to put things in storage. The thing is though, she'd always leave the little door open to the attic and it would frustrate our storyteller. They said it was because they had to keep closing the door, but really I think it was a personal space issue. When you're a teenager, you really don't want your mum going through your room, even if it is to get to another space. Anyway, they said they confronted their mum about it and she said that she hadn't actually been in the attic in months. The redditor was freaked out and decided to investigate what was going on. They kept a note of when they closed the door and it would open again. One day enough was enough and they went in the attic to see what was going on from themselves. This is when they think they saw a face in the shadows. The redditor was so freaked out that they wouldn't sleep in this room anymore. They screamed and they screamed and their parents actually didn't find anything in the attic. Nonetheless, they swapped bedrooms with their brother. 6 months later, they moved out of the house to a bigger place in the area. Now, it turns out that their new physics teacher and wife bought the property. Years later, when the Redditor was a senior in school, the couple offered a tour of their home. It seems her teacher's wife also had issues with the attic door, and that their family dog would often run up to it and bark, and they'd bark, and it would bark. Dogs! I feel like they always know. Did this kid's parents have something to hide? At number 6, we have the Power Ranger. Redditor, I'm touching your toes, freaky, wrote an interesting and perhaps maybe incriminating story on Reddit. They said, when I was around 2 years old, I remember going to the house that we were building and walking through the construction. There was a little spot on the ground where it looked cool to place things, so I decided to put my toy Power Ranger there. Unfortunately, it got buried. Now every time I bring up walking through the construction site, she says that the house was never under construction when we bought it. We ripped out the cement in our garage around the place where I'd left my Power Ranger. It started to crack and we needed to replace it, and lo and behold, my Power Ranger was there. That is specifically the only thing I remember at that age. Obviously, you get very upset when you lose your favorite toy. Now, their parents still deny the fact that the house was under construction, which is really weird. How can we explain the Power Ranger? One response read, it sounds like your parents had a body buried and cemented under your garage, and to be honest, I basically agree. Coming into number 5, we have the Dead End Street. Bored Panda has some creepy little gems. They collated some stories from Twitter, and a Twitter user with the handle Phonetics tweeted out, back in the day, my younger brother used to tell us about his other grandparents. They lived in a blue house. After always telling him that he was making it up, he was adamant, and he told our mother that he could bring her there. So she entertained him. They went for a drive. The tweeter continues by saying, this 5-year-old little psycho gave her turn-by-turn directions for close to 45 minutes. We ended up 4 to 5 towns away in a dead-end street with an abandoned blue house at the end. Now the tweets got over 11,000 likes between them and thousands of retweets. The tweeter followed up by saying, I told my little brother, who's 35, that I told you all this story and he'd forgotten all about it, but he still remembers exactly where that blue house is. Sends chills up my spine. Is this another possible reincarnation story up next, or is it a conspiracy? Whatever's going on, it chilled me at number 4. We have The Other Mother. I'm not crazy throwaway wrote on Reddit, when I was 4, my family got into a very bad car accident. My mum died. I only had a few memories from before the accident, but I do remember my mum. She had brown hair, she was short and a bit chubby. She had a very sweet, toothy smile. I remember her holding me in her lap in the rocking chair. I remember her singing to me. My mum today is a different woman, as in she's actually a different woman. She insists that she gave birth to me. My dad and both my older sisters have no memory of my first mum who died, but I do. All of my memories of my second mum begin after my first mum died. Here's how I know that I'm not crazy. My birth certificate lists my mum's name as Marie, and that's actually not my current mum's name, but she insists it was a clerical error at the hospital that they never bothered to correct. Suspicious. My cousin, who's 11 years older than me, once made an offhand remark about the accident and how different our family would be if it hadn't happened. I asked him what he meant and he said, you know, your mum, but then he wouldn't say anything anymore. Finally, they said whenever I bring it up, my family usually cracks a joke about me being crazy and then changes the subject, but one day I wouldn't let it go, and my sister said to me, sometimes you just need to accept the truth of your life as it is now. There is no truth in the past. I mean, hands up if you actually think that's pretty crazy, because to me, that's heavy. It sounds like there's some kind of weird conspiracy going on and I want to get to the bottom of it. So this is another story from me. Instead of it being my memory as a child, it's actually a memory that my mum has of me. Coming into number 3, we have the doll's heads. Guys, I hate to break it to you, but it turns out I'm a massive creep, and honestly, I'm not too surprised. I don't know if you are. My mum and dad decided to move house when I was really little. Not so little that I couldn't be in my room on my own, but so little that I don't actually really remember this. I suppose I was like 4 or so. So basically they were selling their house, as it was actually a little bit too small for a family of 4. To keep us kids out of the way and to stop us causing havoc when they had people looking around, my mum told my sister and I to go and play quietly in our rooms. Now I had a very active imagination as a child, so I was happy playing by myself. My sister, not so much. Anyway, when my mum came into my room to show the prospective buyer our house, it seems that I was sat in the middle of a circle made up from my Barbie dolls and teddies. Not so weird, right? Well, I had taken off all of the heads of the Barbie dolls and was cupping them gently in my hand. When they came into the room, I looked up at my mum and the visitor, and in silence I smiled sweetly. Again, with the heads in my hand. Suffice to say, that person didn't buy the house. Coming in at number 2, we have the Shadow Walker. This story comes from a guy called Robert and was posted on a chat forum about unexplained and creepy childhood memories, which sounds like it fits the bill for this video. Robert wrote, "When I was younger, around 5 years old, every night I would be playing in the dining room. I'd look out my left window and out the front there would be a figure and something would draw me towards the window. The next thing I know, I was in my bed. The same figure would come to the opposite side of the house and be looking in my bedroom window. That would be that. It never happened at any other house, and I feel like I've always remembered it happening every single night in exactly the same way. I've always wondered what happened. I think what happened is I had a one-time nightmare that scared me so badly it tricked my brain into thinking it was reoccurring. Or possibly it was a reoccurring nightmare, but is that normal for a young kid? Maybe it was something else." So it does actually turn out that young children are more prone to reoccurring nightmares, and actually teenagers are too. It's something about the chemicals developing in their brain, so maybe this is why, but it sure does sound super creepy. Speaking of recurring nightmares, I've saved a really good one for you at number 1. It is bone chilling. We have the Balkan. So I told you a couple of my own stories about the wolf and the doll's heads earlier, but now I want to tell you a story from the one and only Danny Burke. Now I miss him telling excellent stories here on Most Amazing Top 10. He's the best creepy storyteller I know. So I thought, as the next best thing, I would tell you a scary story that he told me recently about a reoccurring nightmare that he's had since he was young, and it recently came back. So you might not know this about Danny, but sometimes he has trouble sleeping. Recently, he woke up in a cold sweat after he was visited by a familiar face in his dream. Now each dream is the same. He thinks he's awake and he senses a presence in his bedroom. The only thing he knows is that he has to keep his eyes shut and not look at whatever it is. He has to go under the covers and not come out. But in his dream, curiosity always gets the better of him, and he unfolds from the covers and he pokes his head out and he opens his eyes to see a decrepit old witch with long black hair, red eyes, white skin, and salt absolutely pouring out of her mouth. She then leans over to him and lets the salt pour into his face and eyes. He can't see anymore. Just as she's about to suck out his soul from a Dementor style kiss, he wakes up. Honestly, the salty witch story was so vivid when he told it to me and so scary. He actually turned it into a scary story on his and Jack Finch's channel Haha Oh No called The Balkan. You should go and find it because his storytelling is, well, you know, you remember.